Hey everybody, Blake T. Wild here, and like a neglectful absentee father, I'm back, everybody! Hey, buddies! What's going on? I'm back! Without any explanation as to where I was. And welcome back to the Ultimate Year, where I am covering the original Ultimate Marvel Universe. So, you all wanted this so bad. So let's get right into it. It's a Thanksgiving Day miracle! Also, make sure to check out my videos on Ultimates Volume 1. No, wait. Ultimates 1, Volume 1, and Volume 2. And Ultimates 2, Volume 1, because this is Volume 2 of Ultimates 2. Released in 2005, written by Mark Miller with art by Brian Hitch. This is The Ultimates 2, Volume 2. The book begins 6 weeks ago. At a nuclear facility in the Middle East, Iron Man and his fiancée, the Black Widow, lead a coalition of superheroes from the European Union as Captain America, already having infiltrated the base, disables the ground-to-air defenses and then escapes with Quicksilver. Then a bombing run commences, and the giant men are unleashed. Iron Man and the others strike at the nuclear silos, and Scarlet Witch uses her powers to, I don't know what she's supposed to be doing, depleting the uranium in the missiles? I don't know, she does something to render them big rods of metal, which is pretty in character for her. Elsewhere, Captain America and S.H.I.E.L.D. forcibly evacuate a nearby town. Cut to the present. Hundreds of Thor testers surround the entrance of the Triskelion. And beneath the Triskelion, Thor tells Tony that no matter how much money S.H.I.E.L.D. spends on security, no matter how tightly they squeeze, there will always be more and more people who slip through their fingers. Tony asks his friend when he became one of the bad guys, and Thor informs him it was roughly around the time that he took part in preemptive strikes against a third world country. Tony reminds him that they had nuclear weapons and were part of the Axis of Evil. But Thor notes that the only country that's ever actually used nuclear weapons as anything other than a deterrent is the country that Tony has pledged his allegiance to. Tony passes the thought away quickly and tells Thor to stop being an idiot and asks what he would have done in the situation. And Thor just kind of looks at Tony pitifully and essentially calls him a, kind of an attack dog for S.H.I.E.L.D. in America. Because wherever they say there's nuclear weapons, that's where the Ultimates are getting sent, no matter what. Then Thor notes that he used to think that Tony was the smart one of the group. Elsewhere in Manhattan, Janet secretly meets with Hank Pym for lunch. And I think it's around this volume or so that Miller starts writing Ultimate Hank Pym in a way that's just far less psychotic than he was, especially at the end of the first volume. Like, they were just so excited to make him this lunatic that uses ants to attack a shrunken Janet when they physically fight each other, and that they eventually just kind of make an effort to forget that part. And all that terrible stuff he did, because they kind of want the reader to be more interested in his stories than they would normally be if they remembered those aspects of the character. So it's kind of like real Hank Pym. Like, they went a bit too overboard, I think, initially, and then they were like, let's reel that back and just kind of act like he's just a poor man who didn't treat Janet well. And that's why she's now dating Captain America. So that's where we're at now. It's interesting to see those parallels occurring between both versions of the character. Anyway, Janet complains about how Steve, a bull-headed man from the 1940s, still acts like a bull-headed man from the 1940s. And she asks how Hank's doing, and he notes that the Defenders group he joined was a total disaster, but he got a new job with a new company. Later that night, at Hawkeye's residence, after Janet and Steve leave after their dinner with the Barton family, Clint's wife brings up the weird energy she noticed between the two when the doorbell rings, and Laura goes to answer it, and she's shot through the head. Masked gunmen rush through the door and head upstairs to the two kids already asleep as three more smash through the kitchen window, firing upon Hawkeye. Callum Barton screams and tries to run away, but he's grabbed, and before the gunmen can shoot him, Clint begins wielding cutlery and turns them into pincushions. Callum runs to his father and panics, and Clint tells his son to run out the back door and get the neighbors and call the special number that he gave him. Then Callum is shot through the chest, and Clint is caked in his son's blood. He cradles the dying body of his young boy and looks up to see someone he recognizes. The next day at Cap and Janet's place, Janet finds Steve on the balcony. He reveals that he's been walking all night because Nick Fury told him everything. The drinks, the lunches, the fact that Janet spent 4 hours alone with Hank Pym at his apartment the other day. He informs her that she shouldn't fool around with him, especially because he's a huge security risk. Then they have an argument and Janet throws a right hook by telling Steve that she hasn't slept with Hank. Yet. So Steve jumps off the roof. Elsewhere, Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. investigate Hawkeye's home and locate the entire Barton family's corpses, except for Hawkeye's. Fury orders to see the secret security camera footage that he had installed without Hawkeye's knowledge. And back at the Triskelion, the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents watch the footage in horror as they learn who was behind this. Later, Steve walks with Bucky through a cemetery as they talk about Steve's current relationship problems and his lament over his elongated life. Then S.H.I.E.L.D. attack! Bucky is removed from the scene as Steve is filled with tranq darts and special S.H.I.E.L.D. agents race in and take him down. Then Fury arrives and slams a gun into his face and asks how much he was laughing behind their back this whole time about what a coincidence it was that Steve, if that is his real name, was just suddenly found frozen in the ocean right when they're putting together a superhero team. Boy howdy, what a neat coincidence that was, right? Then he pistol whips Cap and walks off as he orders S.H.I.E.L.D. to arrest him for murdering Hawkeye and the Barton family. Then Cap tosses a tombstone at the soldiers and begins fighting even though he's filled with half a pint of tetrodotoxin, the toxin inside pufferfish, which, fun fact, he's filled with half a pint. 1 to 2 milligrams is lethal for humans. Anyway, one of the S.H.I.E.L.D. rocket men soars into the air as Steve races for the helicopter and rockets him right into the ground. Man. And a few days later, in an unknown location, Hawkeye is drugged up with truth serum, and the doctor charged with him laughs in his face about all the security codes and information they got from him. And later at Tony Stark's mansion, Tony and his bride-to-be, Natasha Romanoff, hang out while Jarvis has to take care of shit. Tony heads back into the bedroom and says that they can postpone the wedding with everything that's happening. Then they have sex. Meanwhile, at the Triskelion, the Ultimates team up to discuss the situation that they're in. Quicksilver somehow becomes the voice of reason and notes that everything they thought about Thor was wrong, and now they're doing the exact same thing with Captain America. But then it suddenly gets dark, and they realize that the building's security has been shut off as the helicarriers plummet to Earth. And back at Tony's mansion, he hears the destruction echoing through New York, and Natasha sticks a handgun to his head. Then Jarvis walks in, and she wastes no time blasting a bullet through his brain. Meanwhile, a massive mechanical army descends upon Manhattan and marches through the city, accompanied by hundreds of multiple men, or as they're called here, schizoid men, who is actually a clone of the real multiple man. Meanwhile, at the ruins of the Triskelion, the Ultimates try to make their way through the wreckage when Quicksilver races away and begins rescuing as many civilians in New York as he can. It's insane that Quicksilver just becomes one of the most altruistic members of the team outside of Thor, because he fucks his own sister! Anyway, the Schizoid Men army, which sounds like something that would be on 4chan or Wall Street Bets, begin plunging themselves in massive waves across the Triskelion as they are unleashed from the flying ships that have taken over the skies of New York. The S.H.I.E.L.D. Rocket Men and Giant Men and Ultimate Reserves are all released to fight as Jesus Christ, the Schizoid Men are flying through the Giant Men! That one went right through the guy's ear! They're just rocketing through him like bullets! As New York is destroyed, Thor calls out to his long-dead father for help as he hears the thunder and lightning explode in the skies as Perrin unleashes the forces upon the city. And if you want to learn more about Perrin and where he goes in the Ultimate Universe, check out my video on Ultimate Blade versus the Vampire Avengers. And as Wanda desperately tries to hold the magical bubble barrier to keep the endless swarms of schizoid men at bay as they destroy those unfortunate enough not to make it in the bubble, Loki watches over the carnage as a man called the Colonel says that the world will be safe now that the new Roman Empire has been restrained. And yes, he does have a Darth Maul lightsaber. The two watch as the schizoid men then work to topple Lady Liberty, and from Los Angeles to Chicago to Washington, D.C. and everything in between, America falls at the hands of the Liberators. Flashback time. Delegates from China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Syria, and France, for some reason, meet up to discuss a group of superpowered individuals to rival the American Ultimates, the Liberators! Composed of the Abomination, a Chinese scientist who possesses the strength of the Hulk while also retaining his genius intellect, Crimson Dynamo, a Chinese operative who has been fused into his armor and can operate it independently or control the 50 giant-sized duplicate mechs, Hurricane, a genetically modified North Korean woman with super speed, Swarm, a Syrian mutant with the power to control any insects, millions at a time, Perun, a Russian soldier with biomechanical belt and vest similar to Thor, except now he has a hammer and sickle, the aforementioned Schizoid Man, and finally, the Colonel. So you remember when the Ultimates went to preemptively attack that Middle Eastern country and dismantled that nuclear facility and forced the exodus of all those townsfolk from their homes? Yeah, one of them was a teenager named Abdul al-Rahman, and he was enlisted to become an Iraqi super soldier. Back in the present, New York is still under siege as Hank Pym is brought before the Liberators to conduct controls of his Ultron units that the Liberators government funded him to make. And he begins operating the Ultrons to control the civilian population. That's right, Hank Pym sided with the Liberators. This is definitely the worst thing he's done. The Colonel informs him that the priority now is to keep casualties low to ensure that the people don't suffer the crimes of their government. Then he swings into work and orders that the X-Men and the Fantastic Four be brought to Washington and orders Schizoid Man to bring Captain America up from his cell beneath the Triskelion, as well as the rest of the Ultimates and the heads of S.H.I.E.L.D. for execution. Oh, also, Nick Fury lost his right arm in the fight. Back at Tony's mansion, Natasha escorts him out as she reveals that after she kills Tony, she's just gonna steal all of his money from his offshore accounts. Then she recoils in pain, and Tony reveals that the nanites in her bloodstream that let her control the armor he gave her, he controls those. And Tony reveals that he just spent the last 20 minutes stalling until his nanites could download the information about the Liberators directly from her brain. Then he smashes her head with a fucking champagne bottle so hard that it shatters. And then Happy and the security uniform arrive. Tony, Happy, and a team head down to prepare a takeoff of Iron Man. Elsewhere, Hawkeye is still tortured, and his captors prepare to kill him when he rips out his fingernails and uses his marksman abilities to launch them into all their jugulars. Then he orders the Doctor to release him now. Meanwhile, the Jamie Maddox head clone leads his schizoid men, and they find the Wasp. Schizoid Prime grabs her in his hand, and so help me God if he puts her in his mouth. Oh my god, he just slams his fist into her. Janet reverts back to her normal size, and Schizoid Prime chokeslams her against the wall, and Janet reveals that she was able to release Cap 5 minutes ago. And down the hall, Thor is dejected and praying to Odin, asking why he has been so forsaken. And he begs once more to hear his father's voice and to send him a sign. Meanwhile, Cap fucking ruins the Schizoid Man alongside Janet. They embrace and she apologizes for not believing him when he was captured by Fury, and then she tells him how fucked they are. Steve tells her that they'll handle this once they get supplies and he gets his shield. Then they go to release Thor, only to find his cell completely empty. Elsewhere, at the Dome in Brussels, the EU superheroes and organization can do nothing but watch. Dr. Braddock tells his son, Captain Britain, that the Liberators issued a statement that they will use America's nuclear arsenal if any of the EU superheroes dare to act. In New York, the X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man, among many other heroes I'd imagine, are all captured. And in DC, the Colonel is informed that Captain America and Janet escaped as Perun lands Air Force One and President Bush back onto the front lawn. Meanwhile, Janet and Steve land a S.H.I.E.L.D. helicopter in the confusion and escape into the White House, armed to the teeth. Steve performs some light recon and finds where the Ultimates and S.H.I.E.L.D. members are being held, and they get ready, and then Steve kicks the door down, and they find that Hawkeye has already taken care of all of it. But before they can celebrate and regroup, dozens of schizoid men fly through the window. Back in NYC, Iron Man rockets into action in an older suit of his, then continues up and up into the exosphere, where he he arrives at a massive Stark satellite, which houses at least 6 different kinds of armors. Back in Washington, the Ultimates continue fighting as the Liberators enter the action. Swarm assaults Wasp with her insects as Hurricane wallops Hawkeye, and the Abomination goes for Cap. And he is fucking massive! Cap is launched through the wall and back into the White House, where he lands at the feet of the Colonel, who brandishes his dumb Darth Maul lightsaber. But on this one, he can, like, slide the handles, like, up and down to, like, hold it in different positions. Anyway, Hank Pym is hanging out with Loki as he instructs the Ultrons to continue their crowd control. And Loki just kind of laughs at him for still wanting to be a hero. But elsewhere, as dozens of civilians race away in panic and fear from the invading army, a single man stands alone around the explosions of the Crimson mechs as they march towards him. And the machine doesn't halt, and the man doesn't move, and it crushes him beneath its massive foot. And seconds later, the Hulk erupts from beneath, toppling the mech, and then the Hulk just starts fucking destroying these giant Crimson robots, making his way towards the White House lawn. In the White House, Cap stands to his feet, gathers his shield, and asks to know the Colonel's real name, because he likes to know a man's name before he puts him in the ground. Cap readies his shield as Colonel orders the Liberators to stay out of this fight. And then he unleashes his lightsaber as the Abomination pummels the Hulk into the ground. Elsewhere, Hawkeye is beaten to a pulp by Hurricane before Quicksilver takes care of her by running so fast that her bones rumble apart and her molecules disassemble and her body disintegrates. Meanwhile, Cap breaks the Colonel's sword and they have a fucking lightsaber duel. Back in New York, some civilians walk up to the schizoid men as they load up the superheroes to be flown to Washington. One of the duplicates orders the civilians out of the area, and then Captain Britain rips open his suit to reveal his costume. As the sun sets, the Hulk smashes the Abomination with a giant mech, killing him. Nick Fury, Betty Ross, and Wanda escort the president from Air Force One. Then Swarm attacks them as Janet races up and injects herself with an old serum of Hank's, and she grows into Giant Jan and just fucking steps on Swarm. Crimson Dynamo orders his mechs to destroy and kill as many people as possible because this mission is FUBAR, and now he's gonna go kamikaze on the whole thing. Then a fucking laser beam from the sky strikes him directly as Tony arrives drunk in the giant Iron Man 6 armor, a massive satellite ship with giant repulsor cannons built into it, and Tony makes quick work clearing the skies of Washington before charting a course for New York. An Ultron unit informs Hank Pym that the Liberators are in trouble and asks if they should switch their operations to intervene. Pym stumbles past them and orders the Ultrons that it's now time that they let the Ultimates know that he was just infiltrating the Liberators and orders them to begin targeting the Liberators and not the Ultimates. As this is happening, Cap is doing some crazy kicks and slams the Colonel into the pavement. Then the schizoid men gang up on Cap and pummel him as the Colonel brandishes his lightsaber once more. The clone holds Cap in place as the Colonel prepares to execute him via beheading. But as this is happening, Hawkeye and Janet are trying to make their way to Cap to rescue him with the shield. The Hulk shows up. Hawkeye tosses the shield to Hulk, who throws it at such high speeds that it cuts off the Colonel's hands. Cap escapes the grasp of the clones, grabs the lightsaber, slashes them, kicks the Colonel into the pool, and silently drives the lightsaber into his chest. Back in New York, the Fantastic Four, X-Men, Spider-Man, and EU heroes all take battle to the Liberators' army. And in Washington, the Ultimates reconvene with the military as S.H.I.E.L.D. begins taking control of their networks once more. But not before Loki appears! Loki explains that Thor was sent here to bring peace to the Earth, but he's here to do the exact opposite, and is gonna bring about World War III. But then lightning explodes in the sky, and Thor appears. And he slams Mjolnir directly through the neck of his brother. The Avengers gather around the now beheaded Loki until he picks himself back up, and then Jormungandr is magically brought about. Loki begins unleashing his full might of his abilities as he conjures trolls, giant wolves, these horned ogre giants. Thor easily destroys Jormungandr and tackles Loki as the Ultimates wage war against the otherworldly creatures. And Loki pleads with Thor to see the funny side in all of this. How ridiculous it is that he holds these foolish mortal values to heart, even though he's a god. But Thor raises Mjolnir and unleashes its absolute full power onto Loki, sending a blast wave of energy across Washington, D.C., destroying all of Loki's minions. And Thor holds his hand up as the sun begins rising following a full night of destructive, brutal battle, and then ordains that the planet Earth is under his protection. Later in New York, the heroes finally settle things down as the army bases and cities across the country are once again under control, and Reed Richards asks Tony what they are supposed to do now. Tony tells the young man to stop being so earnest. He just repelled a terrorist invasion. It is time to celebrate. The Ultimates reconvene once more as Hank Pym shows up, and he tries to join their celebrations, but Steve tells him to shut the hell up because he aided and abetted foreign terrorists and is going to jail. And meanwhile, Wanda speaks to an Ultron unit. And as the U.S. Army and S.H.I.E.L.D. begin to clear the mess, Perrin surrenders himself as Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, gives a speech about how Vladimir Putin and the Chinese authorities have offered to aid a full investigation of how the Liberators were able to do this. Over on my Etsy shop, BlakeTWild.etsy.com, you can purchase issues 1 and 2 of the Custodians Agents of Cross. Each issue is over 50 pages of pure comics for only $15. You won't find a better deal like that for Marvel or DC these days. What happens when the fate of the world rests on the shoulders of an intelligent baboon, the world's smartest man who has the power of elasticity but only in his right arm, a pyrokinetic teenager, and a 4-armed werewolf? I also have all 5 issues of Destructo Boy available there as well. What's that? You don't like physical comics? Well, great, because over on my Patreon, patreon.com/Smokey'sVideos, I have all the issues available digitally, published on there for only $2. Steve Rogers and Nick Fury watch as the body of Abdul Al-Rahman is carted away. And Steve tells Fury that he wants to quit S.H.I.E.L.D. Fury tells him that the country still needs looking after. Cap informs him that the world needs looking after, and that he and the Ultimates cannot fight America's wars, or any wars, if it opens people up to this kind of destruction. The Ultimates all sit down and have some beers as they discuss what it'll be like to be on their own, without S.H.I.E.L.D's financial support. Then Tony Stark, rich billionaire, soars up and invites them all to their first official independent meeting at his mansion. And a few days later, Natasha Romanoff lies in a hospital ward as the nurse tells her that she'll be just fine after she gets some rest. Then Hawkeye arrives. Natasha leaps from the bed, but is pinned to the wall by his arrows. She stares at him with maddening eyes and asks if he has a message for the wife and kids that she can pass on to him. He tells her she won't see them where she's going, and releases an arrow directly between her eyes, and then leaves. And back in 1942, Steve Rogers walks from a movie theater with his girlfriend, Gail. He apologizes for not having enough money to take her out for a bite to eat. She tells him to knock it off, because tonight is their last night together for who knows how long, and they don't need money to have a good time. She gives Steve a photograph of herself, something to help if he gets homesick, and Steve tells her how beautiful the photo is and how beautiful she is. And then they kiss before heading back to their apartment to really say goodbye to one another. The end. But take note of this. Yeah, there's the panel I just showed you. Now zoom out. The Ultimates Volume 1 and 2, dedicated with love to Stan and Jack. What the hell is that? Why would the Ultimates ever be dedicated to them? You turned their characters into horrible misanthropes. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. What are your thoughts on the ending of the Ultimates? At least from Mark Millar. As far as I'm concerned, this would have been a pretty good place to stop it and not have a third volume be created. At least not by Mark Millar. I think it's the best of the Ultimates volumes. Like the second Ultimates 2 Volume 2, I think is the pinnacle that it reaches. In the first volumes, the characters are still being established. In the first volume, the characters are still being established. They're more or less just symbols of America and S.H.I.E.L.D's kind of like status in the world. We don't really see too much of them or how they really feel about all of this, because it's just kind of non-stop action for the first 2 volumes until we get to Ultimates 2 Volume 1. But by then, and then these several issues, we see actual character moments that make sense and aren't just for shock value. We see Captain America questioning his idealism and his beliefs in America and, what it means to be Captain America, I suppose. Thor's pacifism and opposition to the military-industrial complex comes into play, which, ends up being very validated. And even Tony Stark gets knocked down a few pegs. And I do think that this is the best commentary on America in the 2000s that Mark Millar does in this series, because that's what this whole thing is. It's a commentary on where America was post 9/11, entering the Middle Eastern conflicts once more. The Ultimates are established as this all-powerful militarized superhero team under S.H.I.E.L.D. as an obvious commentary of America's global role, and they're essentially, early on, nothing but tools. Take that however you want. But this is the volume that really brings, I think, the ideas of that kind of commentary to a place where it's not ridiculous. I mean, it's still insane. It's still a comic book story, but this is the one that really pushes the idea of, American interventionism and the hubris and outcomes of their actions and how that affects them. One of the reasons I assume France is part of the Liberators is because, Mark Millar takes all the sort of established, scary countries that are always been deemed as threats to America, and then one of the oldest allies of America, who was very vehemently opposed to the Iraq War and entering the Middle East and protested it, and combine those together. But in fact, every country that is in the Liberators formally protested the American invasions in the real world. So it so perfectly mirrors those real world frustrations that the various countries had with the U.S. at the time, with the turmoil faced in that ever-growing political divide, that they now, in this universe, create their own evil, quote-unquote, superhero team. They act as a complete reversal of everything that we've seen the Ultimates do, of what we might have been cheering for the Ultimates. We're like, yeah, go get them, in the past couple volumes, because just about almost every time we see the Ultimates in action under S.H.I.E.L.D., if it's not, a specific storyline, it's always them going into another country, deposing a leader, or committing an assault upon some facility or something, or a base. It's always something like that, and that's essentially what the Liberators go and do now. It's just here's a taste of your own medicine. It also brings the critique of the just general assumption of the time that America's might makes right, and that it always will be shielded from the consequences of its own aggression. In the comic, it's, of course, an outright fight, whereas in the real world, it was just growing global dissent. Continuing my spiel about why I love this one, is the Ultimates 1 is born out of that paranoia and 9/11 jingoism. Like I was saying, it's purely that early time, and the Ultimates, they serve as saviors and defenders of the American people specifically. They're not a global force, although they act globally, and it's just a celebration of how great they are and how safe they keep us, even if the Hulk was their fault. And Nick Fury is the total embodiment of America, especially the Bush administration America. But in Ultimates 2, we start seeing cracks in this narrative by introducing, how this blind patriotic fervor and can be completely unchecked into this power. Because the Liberators aren't just a physical battle, it becomes a kind of moral battle and a reckoning for some of these characters in America itself. It's like what we see with Cap and Nick Fury at the very end of the book. We see how their claims, Nick Fury's sort of claims to superiority because he has to, he's charged with American security and whatever. It's flawed and extremely dangerous to believe in that thing. He looks down on Cap in that moment where Cap says, he wants to quit the Ultimates and S.H.I.E.L.D. and work to help the world, and Nick Fury's like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Overall, the Liberators are, I would argue, the best and most compelling villains that the Ultimates ever really face in their series. They're the classic comic bad guys, like I said. They're just evil versions of the characters. But they're also this political and societal avatar for the real-world consequences, not just of American actions, but violent sort of military actions between any countries in the world. Their motivations are real-world. They just happen to have superpowers. And this really is the best that the Ultimates ever gets and has been. It's a fantastic development between not just the main characters, but also some of these side characters. Even if we barely see it, like there's still thought put into it, and I really like that. The villains are really well done, I think. As well done as they can be. They only appear in this volume, but it just truly feels like this is a big step forward to continuing the evolution of this universe. This is truly the Ultimates' first real big adventure. They fought themselves with the Hulk to begin with. Then they did that Chitauri invasion, secret invasion thing, which it was a large threat. It wasn't as big as it could have been. All they did was destroy a little bit of Phoenix, Arizona. Then they fought themselves again with Thor in Ultimates 2 Volume 1. And now they face a threat, a massive challenge unlike anything else. The Liberators and Loki. The Ultimates become the underdogs in this book, not just against the forces of, like I said, the Liberators, who are just supervillains, but a literal god. It's almost a proper adaptation of the original 616 mainstream Marvel Avengers, in that Loki is the big baddie who drives them all together to work to save the world. It just exhibits huge, monumental changes, not for just this series, but the characters, their lives, but also in terms of the writing itself. I think the writing in this gets way better. It gets more thoughtful and well executed. Like I said, it's not just... You can see how clearly different Ultimates Volume 1 is compared to this latter half of Ultimates 2. Totally different, more thought out. It's Mark Millar actually trying to tell a story and not just shitting on superheroes. And I really feel like this was the point where Millar was starting to come into his own on this series and putting more effort into it than he did in those earlier issues. And it would have been so cool to see Ultimates 3 by Millar and see where he would have gone with this and how he would have done it. Because now, in the next series, instead of really continuing this sort of train of thought, we get a robot named Ultron, and it's written by Jeff Loeb. Brian Hitch is an amazing artist. No one's ever said otherwise. And this is kind of his last art on the Ultimates, if I remember correctly. It's fantastic work, incredible as always. There's that massive 4-page spread in this book, which is just insane to look at. But my favorite pieces of art from Hitch's work in this volume is Thor. The images of Thor imprisoned through most of the book are so impactful because Hitch is just so brilliantly able to convey just pure emotion into every panel that Thor's in. Like, there truly is life behind those sad little blue eyes. And it's just wonderful what he does in this book. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. As always, check out my Patreon, patreon.com/Smokey's videos for early access to videos. All of my comics are on there. I'm working on another little shorter comic in between working on the Custodians that I'll be uploading specifically to Patreon, so check that out. My Etsy shop, if you want to purchase my comics in person, if you want to purchase my comics not digitally, then check out my Etsy shop. Every purchase from Etsy gets a free head sketch included of any character of your choosing. Follow me on Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, @NotBlakeWild, and I will see you guys next time for Squadron Supreme. Bye!